Thank you very much. And can everyone hear me just fine back there? Okay. But quickly, the thing about cell phones, the best one, instruction. So as a member of Congress, you get briefed by generals and such, and generals are very disciplined, right? And so this was a general, and he told everybody in the audience and members of Congress in the front, he said, turn your phones off. He didn't say put them on silent. So it was like an order coming from a general, so you assumed everybody turned it off. Suddenly a phone goes off, and he looked at that person, he said, that better be God. That was interesting. And by the way, in Congress, we are not allowed shout-outs. You would be ruled out of order, but I think it would add a whole lot to that body right now and so renew some of the spirit rather than what's going on. Red, white, and bruised obviously is a play on words, but it really is to express the current state of affairs nationally. And you can look at what happened in that election and its aftermath and where we are today, even though we haven't reached really 100 days. Generally, that's what we always look at, the first 100 days and such. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about a political career and such, because I'm hoping that some of you will enter public service. So the first thing you need to know is that you have to have a very thick skin. And what I mean by that is that you have to endure and put up with a lot of criticism. Some of it is exceedingly personal, and everything you've ever done in your life is reviewed, examined. They do background investigations and everything else, including even when you were in high school. And let that be a lesson to all of us, especially yours truly. So you have to have this really thick skin. And this is for former Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, beloved Jim Wright from Texas. He once said upon observing a rhinoceros, here is an animal with a hide 2 feet thick, with no apparent interest in politics. What a waste. And it's true. It takes about a 2 foot thick skin to put up with what's going on in today's politics. The other thing is that it's always a learning experience through your whole life, from grade school to middle school to high school to college to grad school to your job and your career, but even Congress. I was elected at a very late age. I was 54 years old. I took my dad's place, who had been there 37 years. I only lasted 14, but I knew that I wasn't going to be there all that long because I couldn't possibly live 37 years. I would have been 37 years, and do the math, 54 and 37? Unlikely, right? But I still remember we got our voting cards. And remember when you first left elementary school, maybe in middle school, high school, you got a locker. What in the heck, the locker? And it had a combination. Everything was a challenge. All this new stuff. Well, in Congress, it's the same thing. So in the House of Representatives, there's 435 of us, which means that you vote electronically, and you have this voting card with your picture on it and everything else. And so it's going to be the first vote. And you're wondering, well, how do I stick this card in there? It's like a credit card. Well, it must have a magnetic strip. No, it doesn't. Must have an arrow. No, it doesn't. So you're wondering how embarrassing this is going to be. I'm going to go up, the first time I'm going to vote, stick my card in there. It's going to be stuck in there in the wrong direction, and everyone's going to say, oh, man, he must be a freshman, which I was. So I started noticing what the more senior members were doing. And there was no real pattern. Everybody was doing it differently. What I found out was it didn't matter how you stuck the card in there. Modern technology and the miracle of technology allowed it to be read no matter what. So even the most basic things in Congress, you're learning day in and day out, from the first time you cast a vote to your last day in Congress. The other thing that I learned was that we were very dependent on the career staff in Washington, D.C., many times demonized and referred to as the bureaucracy, and many times they weren't as cooperative as much as we would like to have been. So one day I was in the company of a great man, former Senator Ben Nelson from Nebraska, and we were addressing a health group in San Antonio, and they were complaining about the bureaucracy, and for good reason. And he said, oh, well, I know you feel victimized by the bureaucracy, but members of Congress, too. We're victims of the weebies. And I thought, weebies? What is he talking about? So someone, thank God, raised their hand and said, Senator, what is a weebie? He says, oh, those are all the career people in Washington that you're depending on for information, and they just look at you because they know you have to run for re-election and there's a chance you're not coming back, and they're thinking, we be here before you, we be here after you. And that's the way it works in Washington. The last thing I want to touch on, because everybody thinks this thing about leaks is something new in Washington. It's been there since George Washington, and sometimes leaks are used strategically. However, many times it really is someone leaking information. They should not be doing it. And this is the irony and the craziness of Washington. This is an actual story from the Washington Post, October 26, 2006. President George W. Bush told his senior aides Tuesday that he, quote, did not want to see any stories quoting unnamed administration officials in the media anymore. And if he did, there would be serious consequences. Said a senior administration official who asked that his name not be used. I mean, you got to go in fear of these things. They're always funnier than real life. But if you look at, and now I'm going to get into the serious part of my speech, so bear with me. If you look at red, white, and bruised, if you really think in terms of the divisions, and how long can we endure that kind of a division? Because Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And he was, of course, talking about the Civil War and everything else. But at what point do we become so divided that we're so dysfunctional that we don't exist as a community of states, cities, a nation anymore? It could very well and it could happen. It could really happen. And that's the whole thrust of my presentation. Now, I was an attorney, which made me an advocate. I was a judge, which made me a referee. And then I was a mediator, which I always thought made me a peacemaker and a problem solver. Then I get to Congress, where I believe that I am now going to be a policy maker. I was much more successful as an attorney, a judge, and a mediator in getting things accomplished than I was in Congress. And that's just an admission. But the reason that I think I was more successful is I was operating in a model where you had uniform rules that were being applied by a neutral or an impartial party that promoted what? Negotiation, right? Compromise, and settlement. When I got to Congress, man, was I in for a surprise, because we didn't have any of those things. Now, how you introduce all those things in those other models to the legislative system is a real problem. But I think Congress really needs help in communicating. You know, what they really need is a mediator. You're not going to get one. But nevertheless, I just was in shock at the lack of dialogue and communication, much less negotiation and settlement, much less. So how did we get to where we are today? Well, you know, if you look at the divisions in this country, they were demonstrated plainly and clearly in the election of 2016. Many of you are aware of the closeness. The presidency, Wisconsin with 10 electoral votes, President Trump wins that by 22,000 votes out of 2.7 million votes cast in the state of Wisconsin. In Michigan, 16 electoral votes, President Trump wins by 10,000 votes out of 4.8 million votes cast. In Pennsylvania, with 20 electoral votes, Trump wins by 44,000 out of 5.7 million votes cast. The total advantage for President Trump from those three states was under 100,000 votes, probably more, under 80,000 votes. But it was enough, taking all the other states, and with those electoral college votes, for him to amass 306 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton's 232. And he wins. Now, you also know that Hillary Clinton actually got more popular votes than President Trump, about 3 million. But I think I read recently, and I know I have some folks from the Bipartisan Center here that can correct me, but that 3 million, the truth is, the margin of victory for Hillary Clinton may have been that or greater just in the state of California. So you can start seeing the divide in the United States. Adding to this division is that it appeared that the majority of people that were voting, when they were polled, were actually voting against the other person rather than voting for someone. And that is never a good recipe for success. You should be voting for someone that you believe in, someone that you want to support, you're excited about on the positive thing, and not necessarily the negatives of the person that is running against them. But that's what we had, and I think you're seeing that play out. But again, think how close that race was. But what it tells you is that whoever was going to win a race that close was not going to be receiving what we refer to as a mandate from the people of the United States to move forward with an agenda. What it tells you is that your country is almost evenly divided. And something is going to give. But you can't go and say that you have received basically the mandate from the people to pursue your agenda and ignore nearly half of the other individuals that voted for your opponent. That just doesn't work whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. In the United States Senate, the Democrats picked up 2 seats. So now the breakdown is Republicans have 52 seats, Democrats have 46. There are 2 independents that basically align themselves with the Democrats. So the breakdown in the United States Senate is 52 to 48. What does that tell you? There is no mandate. There is no mandate for one party to basically seek its own agenda without taking into consideration all of the other people that are represented by those other senators in the minority. That's just the way it tells you that. I'm not sure if people recognize it for what it is. In the House of Representatives, a totally different situation. The Democrats picked up 6 seats. You end up with 241 Republicans, 194 Democrats. But that wasn't. I don't look at that as a mandate. And the reason I say that is because the House has been gerrymandered. And you will study gerrymandering, and that is where state legislatures basically create districts that favor the party that is in the majority in that legislature. That's the way it works. Because legally speaking, at this point in time, you can gerrymander for political advantage. You can't do it to discriminate against someone based on ethnicity or race and things like that. But you can for political reasons, which I'm hoping that the courts come back and examine that. The House of Representatives has been so gerrymandered now that you don't have any real competitive districts anymore. Mine was never going to be competitive for a Republican. It all happened in the Democratic primary. And you can see that, of course, in the Republican districts. The Center for Responsive Politics projected the winners in 368 U.S. House races with 99.7% accuracy without having to consult any polling data. In other words, from the day that everybody filed for office and it was closed, the deadline had passed, they could tell you who was going to win in 368 of 435 seats. There are very few that are competitive. It does get a little worse. Why do we have the congressional gridlock? Well, what I found out when I got to Congress, because I had been out of it, even though my dad was in Congress, I wasn't seeing Dad every day and he wasn't telling me what was going on. You know, I was a judge. I was doing other things. This is what I observed. And it goes on today. Today it's on steroids. But the House Republicans would aim at challenging vulnerable moderate Democrats. Those Democrats we used to refer to as blue dogs. They were conservative to moderate. They're all gone. They're almost all gone. From the day that I got there in '99, fast forward to 2012, they were almost extinct. The House Democrats, in turn, aim at challenging vulnerable moderate Republicans. Wonderful people. And I know the folks that took their place were Democrats, and maybe that even elevated me because it made me part of the majority party, but at what cost? What enduring, prolonged, consequential cost? I think that's what's got us here today. It gets even worse that you not only exclude people in the general elections from being moderates, you get rid of your moderates in your primaries. You've heard of being primaried out? That means if you're a Democrat and you're a moderate, maybe a liberal will beat you. If you're a Republican and you're a conservative or a moderate, a conservative is going to beat you. It's always someone to the left of you or someone to the right of you. So what is that doing? You have more people on the left, more people on the right. You no longer have what? A middle. And I'd really be surprised. I think if you looked at my voting record, I would be left of center for sure. Very liberal on social issues. Moderate, I think, in energy and such, because I'm from Texas, so you know what that means. But it was very, very interesting. I don't know if we have moderates anymore. This was happening long ago. In the state of Texas, I've got to tell you a couple of stories. One is this wonderful man named Bill Ratliff. Bill Ratliff was the Republican lieutenant governor, and he was going to seek election because he had been appointed by his fellow senators to fill a vacancy. And so he was traveling all over Texas. And what he found out when he was traveling all over Texas, that his opponent, David Dewhurst, who had vowed to spend whatever amount of money it took to defeat him, was pretty popular because Mr. Dewhurst was to the right of Mr. Ratliff, who was a moderate. And the way he put it, and this is a story from the New York Times way back in 2001. And when Mr. Ratliff started meeting with Republican contributors, he found that the term moderate doesn't go down well in some places. That sounds real Texas. Doesn't go down well in some places. Now, he said he was saddened by his decision not to run. But more than that, he was relieved. He grinned in remembering a suggestion that one of his advisors had made about an exit strategy. Because you just can't decide not to run without a reason, you know? In Texas, you'd say, that's cutting and running, you know, and you don't cut and run in Texas, right? So he was going to have an excuse, and the advisor said, why don't you say you're dropping out because you have a fatal disease? So Mr. Ratliff said, laughing, yep, the fatal disease is independence and moderation. Think about what he was saying. He's a wonderful man. I mean, this guy was just beyond belief. Now, that was on the Republican side. Democrats? Guilty. Because I'll tell you what we were doing before 2001. We weren't looking favorably to those Democrats that were middle of the roaders. That's what we call them in Texas. He's a middle of the roader. You know, moderate, centrist. Nope, middle of the roader. I love this guy, but this is what he said. We had a Texas Agriculture Commissioner, Jim Hightower. And so they asked him about, well, you know, what about the middle of the roaders? And this is what he said. There is nothing in the middle of the road except yellow stripes and dead armadillos. So moderates, middle of the road, or centrists have never been held in high esteem, but today, like I said, you know, maybe they're dead armadillos out there, and that's all that's left. I'm not real sure. Is there hope? Are we resigned and relegated to being endlessly in this gridlock? You know, I hope not. This is what has to happen. And a lot of ifs here. The president must reach out to form coalitions with proposals that start conversations among members of Congress from both parties. The Senate must retain the 60-vote rule. The 60-vote rule in the Senate is what makes it the greatest deliberative body in the world because it empowers the minority. You never get a vote on the floor unless you reach the 60 votes. So even if Democrats only have 48, 46 Democrats, 2 independents, that equals 48, guess what? They can bottle things up if they're totally ignored. Because, look, majority rule is really an important principle and concept, and it is necessary, but not to the extent where you exclude completely the minority. It just doesn't work that way, especially when this country is so closely divided. The House, its equivalent, they have to do away with what is referred to as the Hastert Rule. What's the Hastert Rule? The Hastert Rule was this. If you're in the majority party and you're the Speaker of the House, then what you do is basically what Speaker Hastert said back then. The job of the Speaker is not to expedite legislation that runs counter to the wishes of the majority of the majority. Meaning, no piece of legislation sees the light of day on the House floor, unless the majority of the majority agrees. So what happened to those other 200 plus or whatever it is members of the minority party, whether they be Republican or Democrat? They're totally ignored and taken out of the legislative process. That means all the people that they represent don't They do not have a voice. They make no contribution to legislation. And that's what, look, that's the reason I left, all right? 2012, I knew I was going to leave. Now, a lot of people were happy that I was leaving, but it opens a door for another generation. And in that, I guess the silver lining for me was that I knew we had somebody waiting in the wings that was a true talent, and that was Joaquin Castro. And Joaquin Castro took my place. And it was time for me to do some other things. But just because there was no sense of accomplishment. Majority rules is a good rule. But this is what someone said once. Democracy, where the majority rules, is more than two wolves and a sheep voting on what to have for dinner. Think about that. And that's where we are today. And I guess that's what really frightens me. Now, the other thing, and this is really important, and I think you're going to relate to this. In the House of Representatives, you have to basically stay with a thing called regular order, meaning that a piece of legislation or a bill goes to a subcommittee, then it goes to the committee, then it goes to a rules committee, and then it gets to the floor, and hopefully there's a good rule that will allow amendments. Why is that important? Because it is in the committee environment that members of Congress are relevant, where they have a say, but more importantly, it's where you develop relationships. There's 435 members of the House. You get there on Monday, you vote around 6, and they just want you to get there that evening to vote so that you're there the next day to start. And then you're going to leave Thursday afternoon, or you get there on Tuesday and you're going to leave on Friday, and I mean your day is jam-packed. And it's not with meeting other members, your colleagues, except when you are in the committee environment. Those are where the relationships are established. That's where you have cooperation and dialogue and communication. In your own lives, the truth is, I don't know how big your schools are, but we've got schools in San Antonio that are 2,500 student population. Now, the truth is, how many of the 2,800 do you know? Who do you really know? People in your class. The committee room is the equivalent of the classroom for members of Congress. That's where we get to know each other. We've got a lot of things in common. The jurisdiction of the committee, the issues. We know a little bit more about that issue than other members of Congress. We get to know each other. We start talking about our families. Absent that, you'll never see individuals. I see people being interviewed today, and I say, oh, I served with him. Did you know him? No. Did you know Devin Nunes? Sort of. I said hello to him once, yeah. But I mean, we all served together. Why didn't I know him? We weren't on the same committee. That's what it was all about back then. If the president doesn't reach out, and this is where you should be concerned, and the American public should be concerned, but you don't know about this till it's too late. You want to avoid a constitutional crisis. It is not good for anyone when this happens. This is not what our founding fathers put in place or in motion when they created the three branches of government and the checks and balances that you read about in class today. If the president fails to reach out to Congress, or Congress doesn't work with the White House, the president will then attempt, and predict me because they all do, to circumvent Congress with executive orders and agency and department directives. It's not supposed to work that way, right? Legal challenges will follow. Either groups, individuals, or Congress itself will sue the president. We've done that too. So guess what happens? The governance function will then shift from the executive and legislative branches to the judicial branch. Now, I was a judge. As a matter of fact, the greatest faith I have in any of the branches actually is the judicial, because I was a lawyer and a judge, and that's my little world. I'm more comfortable in it. Doesn't make it right, by the way. That's not what the founding fathers envisioned. As a matter of fact, they really believed that the judicial branch would not have the power that it has today. But it has evolved in that fashion. This is the irony of that the least democratic branch of the three branches of government, by default, will assume the role of the executive and legislative branches. That's because the executive and the legislative branch aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then everything becomes a legal issue that has to be determined by the third branch. That is not good. Now, how do we avoid that? How does the legislature avoid ceding power to the executive or the judicial branch? And you're going to find out what it's like to vote, because this afternoon you're going to do a simulation. It's going to be very interesting, because I'd like for you to maybe apply a certain test as you go through the consideration in your vote. This is what Congress is going to have to do. They have to follow the Gephardt rule. What's the Gephardt rule? Well, Dick Gephardt was the minority leader when I got to Congress, and we had freshman orientation. Yes, we have freshman orientation. Remember, we don't even know where the restrooms are when we get there. And this is what Dick Gephardt said. Look, when you vote, vote your national interest first. Vote your congressional district second. And vote your party last. He said, it's going to make it real hard for me to gather you guys up and stick with me on issues, but you have to face yourself in the morning in that mirror. Now, that's the Gephardt rule. As you know, in the past few years, we just turned it on its head. The next thing, and this is the most important lesson for anyone to follow, and it's well worth the sacrifice. Follow the Carl Elliott model of public service. Well, who in the heck was Carl Elliott? Very interesting man. He was a congressman in the 50s and early 60s from the great state of Alabama. And he started out as a segregationist. Towards the end, he didn't want it to be the end of his career. Turned out that it was. He voted for certain pieces of legislation that allowed something like the Civil Rights Act to be considered and passed. So he wasn't very popular back home, and he was defeated. Years later, he was recognized when he was awarded the Profile in Courage Award. And this is what he said when he accepted it. And you got to remember, this is a man, all he had when he left Congress, when he lost, was his congressional pension, which he cashed in to run for governor and lost. I mean, this is an incredible individual. And this is what he said. Some people say I was ahead of my time, but I was really behind the times that ought to be. You're always moving to something better. You're a step forward in that process. If you want to just there and mark time, not move into a better place, that's your choice. And you can do that and probably get reelected. You're safe, predictable. But it's not good. It's not good for the United States. It's not good for your district. It's just plain not good. But that's what happens. The last thing that has to happen, a certain prayer has to be answered. What am I talking about? Gephardt rule, Congressman Elliott, and a prayer. All right. On January 5th, 2011, every 2 years there's a new Congress. At that time it's the 112th Congress, which was the last one that I attended. We have a chaplain, and he opens the Congress with a prayer. And this was Father Coughlin. Quote, by setting single-minded self-interest aside in the search of the common good, may a just society flourish with the gifts of your spirit and be recognized by others for its equal justice, unity, and peace. Lord, may the 112th Congress of the United States of America be an instrument of your goodness with abiding laws embraced and clarity in policy statements reaching beyond institutional thinking and public opinion polls. Now, Father Coughlin's prayer was not answered in the 112th Congress. It was not answered in the 113th Congress. It was not answered in the 114th Congress. We are now in the 115th Congress, and we'll see where it all goes or where it ends up. This is the danger, and I'm going to be quoting somebody. I really admire this particular writer, and you probably need to be reading his columns, Michael Gerson, Gerson. This is an article that just appeared on March 28th, and he's describing the present political landscape as occupied by two tribes. Remember that division I was telling you about? We now are thinking in tribal terms in this country. We are separating ourselves into tribes. Tribe A filters all facts for the benefit of that tribe. In this approach, information is only useful as ammunition. Tribe B views Tribe A as merely fighting for privilege for some and oppression for all others, and dismisses Tribe A's views as a matter of bad faith. He goes on to observe, quote, "The main problem with tribal definitions of truth is that conflict can only be expressed in combat, verbal or otherwise. If rational arguments conducted in good faith, holding out the possibility of compromise, are impossible, there is only one way to decide between conflicting views, and that is the exercise of power. If the enemy is beyond persuasion, all that remains is compulsion." And that's what you see today. You're always looking at the parties and the two tribes and the division of Americans, always butting heads. And this is where I have a slide, and if you'll go to the first slide, I don't know if you can see it very well, because I really love this slide, because it really tells you, it demonstrates in a picture what is real hard to say in 1,000 words. You can't, I don't know how many of you know what that is, I'm going to tell you in a minute, but you look at that and what in the world is that? Remember I was telling you about butting heads and everything else? Bad things can happen. So now if we go to the last slide, which also shows this picture, slide 2 is there it is. Two moose locked antlers in a fight, then froze together. There are no winners. There are only losers. I mean, I know that my former colleagues in Congress, because this is being obviously streamed and taped and everything else, with all due apology and respect and everything, that's where you are. But the consequence is going to be felt by you, the American people. So I've got a solution. Now, aren't I just the most brilliant guy you've ever had up here? How many of you want to know the solution? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Come on. You want to know. This is the truth. This is the solution. All right. Put your hands down. Guess what? You are the solution. You probably saw that one coming. So this is what you need to be doing as you prepare to lead, as you cast a vote as to who you think might represent your interests. Keep an open mind. Educate yourself. Understand that a person who holds an opposing view is not your enemy. She or he may be your opponent, but they are not your enemy. Lastly, and this is where this is the grandfather and father. Do more than engage and participate electronically. This is really important. I'm not saying put your smartphones away. I don't want you to do that. I couldn't do that myself. But you got to live more than through the smartphone. It's just the way things are going to happen. And people will take advantage of you if you think you can lead a life simply online. It doesn't work that way. So in 2008, the San Antonio Express-News went and interviewed two college students, Sarah and Allison, from Trinity University there in San Antonio. And this is what Allison told a reporter. She didn't like the false sense of involvement that signing up for various political and social groups on Facebook provides. She articulated, quote, "You're taking a step, but it's a virtual step. And you have to take a physical step as well. So my wish for you going forward, and maybe you're already doing it, and bless you for that, is that you take a physical step that brings our country closer to what Congressman Elliott referred to as the times that ought to be. And maybe, just maybe, Father Coggan's prayer will finally be answered." Thank you very much. We have time? I think we've got time for Q&A.
One of the things that we've heard over and over again is that representatives used to live in D.C., their children used to go to school together, and that more and more that's not the case. People return to their districts, they spend half weeks in D.C. What is it that changed, and is there any taking it back?
You know, really, I think it was just a sign of the times with transportation, the ease of, you know, in the old days, think in terms of what it took just to get to Washington, and then the schedule. I still remember in freshman orientation the wisdom of Dick Gephardt, but the one thing he said that he surely didn't mean, he said, our schedule always takes families into consideration. That's just not true. A political career, and especially one where you have to travel to Washington and you don't live in Maryland or Virginia, is time-consuming. And you have to be back in your district. You run every 2 years in the House, so you have to have a presence. And you have to raise money. And that means you have the fundraisers and stuff, and you're going back home and all of that. And basically, it was just really a function or an operation of times, convenience, the ability to do things. Then the cost of elections and such, it's just changed the whole dynamic. And people believe that maybe that was the beginning of the end, but not really. I don't think so. My father was elected in 1961, and he just came home. I'm going to tell you something, and you know, most members of Congress are not wealthy. I lived on my paycheck. And you have to maintain 2 residences. And an efficiency apartment in Washington, D.C. can run you $1,600 to $2,000. And you have a budget in your office that if you go over your budget, it comes out of your paycheck. And that budget pays for all your staff, the rent for your office back in the district, all your computers and everything else. You cannot afford to bring your family to Washington, is what I'm trying to say. Even though that's what I told the young members as they were coming in, if you can financially do it, bring your family to Washington, spend a little more time, go home every other weekend or third weekend, have a great presence and everything else. But it's nearly impossible. And that's why I always go back to the committees where the relationships are built, because that's where you're going to see them. When I first got to Congress, we used to have a bipartisan retreat. That ended. All the discussions were supposed to be in confidence, and the next day you would read about them in the paper. And so, I mean, leadership just gave up on them. I'm not sure that they really accomplished that much, but I think that's what it's not very doable to have your family there anymore.
I'd like to go back on what you were talking about gerrymandering. An example of this that I know of is in Georgia, where the Republican Party is doing exactly that. What I like to know is what the Democratic Party there could do, and if it's happening here, what the opposite party could do. How can we as a people fight against gerrymandering is what I'm asking, basically.
Well, and this is a difficult one because, look, political advantage, both parties love it, right? I mean, if you can create districts where you maintain the majority, that's what you want to do. Because being in the minority, you can be really irrelevant at times. So I understand the political considerations, but I think what's going to happen is that you might equate political advantage with discrimination against certain groups. And I think then the courts will start looking at things differently. And we just had a decision out of San Antonio, a 3-judge panel, that found that Texas had engaged in that. Because then all sorts of things kick in then. Pre-clearance or approval of maps, which was done away by the Supreme Court. Congress could reinstitute a certain test and we would have pre-clearance again. And that was very helpful because it did keep Republicans and Democrats in check from overreaching, which is a human tendency. But I don't see it really happening. There is another model, and it's a much better model. It's not pure, it's not perfect, and that is having independent commissions draw the lines. California, other states do it, and they do end up with better districts, a little more fair, definitely, but it's real hard to get that passed in a state legislature where the majority would have to be voting for a proposition that diminishes their power to maintain the majority. So it's kind of a vicious, a cycle or circle. There was an organization that was going to attempt to do something called independent lines, bipartisan, trying to get commissions established in all of the states that don't have them, and they had even chosen a state to try that, and I'm not sure what happened to it. It would take a real effort, but it doesn't mean that it should not be undertaken.
According to the New York Times, Fortune magazine, and OpenSecrets.org, over $2 million have been spent so far on lobbying for a bill that would repeal FCC regulations on net neutrality and the selling of consumer internet data without the consumer's consent. Now, this bill has already passed in the House and the Senate and is moving on to President Trump. My question is this a new trend in politics? Are we moving towards an era in which the little guy is overshadowed by big corporations and big money in politics? And Congressman specifically, have you ever experienced this type of lobbying that you feel has influenced your decisions?
Anyone that tells you that money doesn't gain access is just not being honest with you, because a member of Congress has to maintain a healthy campaign war chest so that you don't have everyone running against you, and you're ready for whatever the competition may throw at you, so that you need to be doing fundraising. Now, the people that are going to be most interested in you are going to be obviously people that have business before your committee, because you're the committee of jurisdiction. So I was on energy and commerce, so we had telecommunications, we had net neutrality, we had the privacy issues. So, and I loved it. I loved that more than anything else. We also had health, which was the Affordable Care Act. We also had energy. I'm from Texas, so oil and gas, fossil fuel, and I still believe in renewables and alternatives. So you would have all those different interests with their advocates, which are lobbyists, and yeah, they overwhelm, let's say, on the energy part, they overwhelm the environmental groups, right? On telecommunications, they overwhelm the privacy and net neutrality faction out there, because then the individuals that you have are going to have your internet service providers, for instance. All right? I mean, because it's all about information, not getting you to give me permission to figure out who you are so I can sell all the information. As a matter of fact, most of you out there, we all agree to the terms, and that means they're following everything that you're doing. They can tell us more about us right now than you. It's unbelievable. But the answer to your question is you have to be very, very careful. You have to talk to everyone, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes they're right, even though they come from a big, powerful interest with a big, powerful lobbying firm. They're not all wrong, and it's all about education. But you should be reaching out to the other side. I was blessed because when I was a lawyer, to prepare for trial, you had to be ready to argue the other side. And when I was a judge, I made them argue both sides. It was wonderful. It was incredible. So you have to educate yourself as to the pros, the cons, and sometimes there's more than two sides. But I would say there is no question that big money and lobbying does have influence, because I think they get more access and they get an audience more so than a lot of other people might. And I think that's dangerous. What's really dangerous is if someone is swayed by a political contribution. At the end of my career, and I love all the folks in my two major corporations there, but they didn't support me anymore, because I was for the energy bill. I was for cap and trade. Well, the fossil fuel guys don't like that. They didn't like it. They didn't like fuel economy standards. I was for those. I wanted to keep raising them. And we've done well with them, by the way, right? No one has really suffered. And I was for renewables, and I wanted all the subsidies and the grants for wind and sun. But you got to remember, when you're advocating for those individuals, there's someone else out there looking at it from a totally different point of view. The fossil fuel people should be concerned, because you're telling them that coal is outdated and there's nothing you can do. That we don't want to run cars on gasoline and oil products anymore. And for a lot of good reasons. But it's a transition, so you can't do it overnight, and you don't want to be unreasonable. So all that is happening. But I think you point out a good point. A lot of the things that are being done today when it comes to the internet, because Congress wasn't doing anything, you had the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, move forward with regulations and such regarding net neutrality. Most of y'all know what that means. It gets complicated, of course. And privacy. But yes, those were very close votes, by the way. But your member of Congress should have been hearing from all of the young people. Many of y'all can vote. When I was young, you couldn't vote at 18. But a lot of y'all can. And they will listen to you if you get a group together.
And I was wondering if you can have like a job in government and have like no knowledge of politics or whatever, like maybe at a libertarian level.
Okay, this is terrible to say. For public office, you don't have to know anything and still run, and you might win. Now, to have a truly, remember I was telling you about the bureaucracy and the professionals? Those are really great people because they are experts in their field. And they have to be there as we vote one group in and vote another. There has to be some continuity, and there have to be experts out there, and they have to work in government. All the experts cannot simply work for the private sector. Because then what happens is exactly what this young man was pointing out. There's going to be a whole perspective that is lost. Because all the experts are over there in private, they're giving you all the information. You go to the government sources and they don't have up-to-date information and they're not as thorough. You're at a disadvantage as a representative taking all of the pros and the cons. So yes, there is a place for you, Libertarian, Democrat, Republican, Independent, I don't care who you are. If you want to work in government, you're needed. Your area of expertise is needed. Now, the downside, you're not going to make as much money as the person in the private sector. Okay? And you better accept that from the beginning, from day one. But it's well worth it for what you're doing and the difference that you're making. You know, get into those times that ought to be, whether it's in public office or doing something else.